Well, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the Felis 747-200. This is part 5 of the video series, and eventually, after several months, we're going to land the aircraft. My apologies to those of you who've been waiting a few months for this video. It wasn't my intention to delay it quite as long as it took. We'll talk a little bit about that on the descent. The first 4 videos were filmed as a continuous sequence. This video is obviously not continuous, so there may be some flight continuity errors as we go through that. I hope that won't be too distracting for you. We're just in the final stages of the flight from London over towards Phoenix. We're just approaching the Rattlesnake VOR, we're about 10 miles away from that. And then we're going to turn and fly down towards Zuni. We're still using the INS for navigation. We're at flight level 380, doing Mach decimal 85. You can see we're about 5 miles from the turn. There's a little bit of INS error has been built in here, but as I said, this flight isn't really a continuation of the full flight over from London, so there will be less drift on the INS than you may expect at this point in the flight. So here's the Rattlesnake VOR, and then we're going to route down towards Zuni on the Hsi arrival. From Zuni, we're going to turn right, fly out towards Hsi, and then down towards Phoenix. We'll land on runway 08 on the ILS. The first thing that causes people a lot of issues with this sort of flying, when you don't have an FMS to predict the descent path for you, is how to work out the optimal descent points. There is actually a very easy way to do it on this aircraft, as long as we keep it simple. One of the things you've got to do with the INS is do what's called a Position Update Eradication when you get on the ground. That's removing all the updates and then seeing how far from the parking stand the aircraft thinks it is to see how well the INS has been performing. So what we can do is say that landing on runway 08, we're going to park on the international terminal here, probably stand Bravo 27. If I get the coordinates for stand Bravo 27, I'm going to enter those into the INS units. So I'm going to put the units into remote, remote, and remote. And what I'll do is look at the waypoints. Waypoint 6 is blank, it's the last waypoint. So I'm going to put in Bravo 27, let's say north, 33, 26, 3, insert, and west, 111596, insert. And that just gives me an additional waypoint to use to evaluate the drift when we get on the stand. If I come down to waypoint or to INS Unit 3, however, I can tell Unit 3 to do waypoint change 0 to 6. And that tells me it's 264 miles or 32 minutes to Phoenix. So that gives me a distance directly from here, the present position, to the parking stand. When we're this far out, the parking stand is close enough. It doesn't need to be any more accurate than that. All I'm going to do is base my descent on how far away I am from Phoenix. I'm not going to worry about the fact that we've got a little turn here and a little bit of deviation there. That doesn't matter. Let's just keep it simple and say it's this distance here that I'm interested in. You'll notice on the arrival, as we get down through Hsi and Eagle, down to Bunter, we've got a heading off Bunter. There isn't a procedural arrival into Phoenix, and the lost com procedure says after Bunter, proceed direct to the VOR. So we need another way of sorting this out, and what I'm going to do is basically self-vector myself. In the USA, it's very straightforward, because I can actually load the charts on here. If I go to maps, I can load this is the flyway chart because it's a little bit easier to read. But basically I'm going to use that to take myself from this kind of inbound track here, vector onto downwind and then turn and then land on runway 08. And that's not really cheating because in the real thing you'd have a radar controller to look after you, and we're just going to do a little bit of that job as well. So as I mentioned, we're still flying on INS navigation. Rattlesnake is 25 miles behind us and Zuni is 94 miles ahead of us. If we listen to ident nav1, we're listening for RSK, That's RSK, and Zuni, ZUN. You can see the ident on here. That's ZUN. Excellent. So all I want to do is transition from INS navigation to radioid navigation. The autopilot's following the INS. The first thing I have to do is to swap the Hsi displays for both pilots over to radioid navigation. Remember from the second video when we flew the departure, in dual mode the left pilot sees number 1 and the right pilot sees number 2. If I use number 1 mode here, that's looking at Rattlesnake behind. If I go to number 2, that's looking at Zuni ahead. And that's really what I want. So I'll align the heading bug, because we have to go through heading mode. We transition onto VOR. I'll give it a little bit of a steer towards, so onto heading mode. And then gradually over towards forelock. And it should capture and fly towards Zuni quite happily here. After Zuni, we're going to make a right turn onto course 242. So Zuni's on the right hand side. All we're going to do is change the course on here. That means the left side radio is not doing anything important just now. So I'll change it to Winslow 112.6 and the course 180. And that's us ready to fly outbound from Winslow. We've got a DME from it already, so we can ident that as well. Looking for ... That's Winslow. Excellent. So that's all idented. Because we're going to fly down to Phoenix and fly this ILS approach, remember we're going to fly downwind and turn. If I got to the Phoenix VOR, or the Phoenix airport, at 0 altitude, that would be very inefficient. I've got a whole downwind track to go, crosswind, and then, downwind base, and then onto ILS. ILS is going to be a minimum of 9 miles across. Let's say that's 10 miles, up to about, let's say 20 miles. So if I get to 7,000 feet above Phoenix on the downwind leg, that's about 8,000 feet barrow, then that's roughly where I want to be. So I've got 30,000 feet to lose. I'm at 38,000 feet. I want to be at 8,000 feet when this counter here gets down to 0. Now 30,000 feet to lose, multiplying that by 3, that gives me 90 miles. I'm actually going to start the descent a little bit before that. We'll start the descent at maybe around about 105 miles. It really is no more complex than that. I've still got the ground speed displayed from the INS, and I can use that for my calculations. The actual ILS approach itself is very straightforward. We can't set it up just now because we're still using the radio aids, but we can have a look at it. We've got some step down fixies. It's a fairly typical ILS at 3 degrees. The missed approach goes up to 5,000 feet, and the minima we're interested in today is 1370. So I'm going to set 1370 on the bug here just as a reminder. On the radio altimeter, I've set it to just over 60 feet. So I mentioned at the start of this video that it took a little bit of time to get this video recorded. I initially did the whole flight in one recording session, and in the final stages of the flight I had a simulator crash, which was quite frustrating. It took a couple of days until I attempted it again, and at that point the version of the 747 had been updated. When I was involved in the beta program, it flew really nicely, it landed really nicely, and the ground effect was nearly perfect on the aircraft. You could land it like a 747 is reputed to be landed. After it was updated, the changes to ground effect made the final stages of flying the aircraft very unsatisfactory, and it was quite frustrating to fly it. And it took a long time to get that resolved. To be quite honest with you, it's still not as good as it was in the beta. It's still doing something a bit unpredictable at low level, but it is mostly flyable at the moment, although don't expect every landing to be a nice soft landing with it. Right, we are 53 miles away from Zuni. If we pop up the X-plane map just now, you can see that we're tracking quite nicely. Straight line between Rattlesnake and Zuni. The initial part of this was done on INS, and then we've gone over to radio aid navigation. Now if you look on this display here in the HSI, you'll see there's a little bit of error showing. That's because the Zuni VOR isn't correctly aligned. The zero radial doesn't quite point to magnetic north, so to fly directly towards this on a magnetic indicator, the needle won't be quite in the middle, and that's very common. That's a real life thing. There is a little bit of an issue with the Felis aircraft again, that the RMI doesn't quite line up. The RMI should be pointing roughly on the same radial here. The tail should be on 010, and it's not quite there. But if you fly on the HSI, it should be okay. To do the turn at Zuni, you can see my airplane symbol coming in here. To do the turn, I'm going to put the aircraft into heading mode when we're about 10 miles to run, and then I'll just fly the turn manually in heading mode onto 242 and fly outbound. Within 10-15 miles of the VOR, the Vorlock mode is it's unreliable because you're very close to the station, so little changes will make a huge difference in the course. So it's easier just to fly it in heading until you get a stable, reliable nav solution on there. I'll also leave the overlay on of the position symbol when you're learning to fly aircraft like this using VOR navigation. This isn't cheating, this is just another tool to help you work out where you're going. For the flight engineer stuff, it's really entirely straightforward. We've got a reasonable amount of fuel. We've got 22 tons, which is a good place to be. We've got the fuel balanced in the tanks. I've got the reserve tanks to open when we start the descent, and we've got the pressurization to change, and that's pretty much it for the flight engineer on this flight. All we've got to do is open the reserve tanks to make sure that number 1 and number 4 have got all the fuel, and deal with the pressurization. "30 miles, so about 25 miles until we make the turn." I did think about trying to cut this video a little bit shorter, or maybe skip ahead through certain parts of it, but the rest of the video series on the 747 has been quite drawn out, quite long form videos. I thought it'd be better just to stick with that format for this video. The most important thing when you're flying these big airplanes, any jet transport, is to do things slowly and methodically. Don't rush into anything. Just have a plan of action and execute that plan of action. So where are we? About 3 minutes until it thinks we get to Zuni. It says 27 miles and we've got 28 on there. So a little bit of error coming in. We're trying to stay as far ahead as possible with what we've got on the radio aids. So I've got Winslow already tuned up and idented, ready to go. We've got the course out of Winslow already pre-selected, and that means that everything on the flight control unit here is ahead of us. There's nothing behind us. 188 miles. Remember I said I'm going to descend at approximately 100 to 105, that sort of area. Because I'm doing the job of 3 crew, we'll maybe descend a little bit earlier, and just to manage the workload here. I've got a joystick binding for my vertical speed control. That's going to be my primary control for managing the final stages of the descent. If it's not on screen, I'll try and explain what I'm doing with the vertical speed control if I'm using my joystick binding for that. Excellent. 19 miles, so just make sure that the heading bug is lined up, and I'm going to put the aircraft into heading mode just now. Now, the next course that I want is course 242. I can select that already on the correct side. It's this one here, 242. And you'll note that I can still basically fly it towards Zuni using the RMI indicator. Even though there's a little error on that at the moment, it's easy enough to keep it straight ahead over a few miles, and the RMI is very useful for this kind of thing because it's almost as easy to fly on the needles as it is to fly on the HSI. As far as the performance goes, as I said, continuity reasons, I haven't done the full flight, so my load sheet doesn't quite match up with where it's supposed to be, but we can click this button here and read the values from the sim. it's going to be a flat 30 landing we do here. Just imagine clicking on the hotspot here is asking the flight engineer for the precise speeds for you. He's going to get a sharp pencil out and work those out for you. So 10 miles before Zuni. We're actually closer than 10 miles because we're 6 and a bit miles up here. So when that gets to 6, we'll be directly overhead. So I'll just start the turn roughly where I want to go. Let's say about 2:30, and we'll watch the needle swing around the left hand side of the aircraft. So still counting down. Maybe 225. I'm sure the old VOR pilots had lots of rules of thumb for calculating these turns. It becomes as much as a little bit of art as well as science. So just waiting for that needle to swing round roughly towards 240, 250, and then we'll adjust the course to fly outbound. You see we're nearly there anyway. So I mentioned about 65 feet on the radio altimeter. That's not for anything real flight related. We wouldn't use the radio altimeter for Category 1 ILS approach landing. However, it is beneficial to help us offset some of the oddities that have been introduced to the flight model at low level. Here's the course pointer coming in, so I'll just turn it around roughly to 240, 242. So the radio altimeter will help us offset the issues we've got with the X-plane flight model. At very low level, there's a tailplane horizontal stabilator ground defect issue that causes the aircraft to nose down. We just have to be wary of that. There's nav mode and forelock. And we'll fly outbound. And the next thing we do is get to 91 miles, and then we'll transition to following the radial out of Winslow. So looking for 91, counting up on the number 2 DME here. And it's the same thing, about 10 miles to go, so 81 miles. We'll swap onto heading mode. We'll change the nav pointer over to the left hand side, and we'll follow out from Jessie down to Eagle. Note there that it goes from, Jessie is, what's that, 29.6 out to 57, so it's only a, 20 mile leg between Jessie and Eagle. Looking down here, 153 miles to go, so we'll descend in approximately 45 miles. And as I said, the whole point with this is to keep the flight as relaxed and as slow-paced as possible. You don't want to be rushing to do anything at the last minute. It's a bit harder when you have to do your own radar vectoring in the final stages, but we can live with that. Keep everything as simple as possible. Let's have a look at the chart that we're going to use for the radar vectoring or flying out here. This is Class B airspace between flight level, or between 9,000 feet and 8,000 feet. You can see it steps down as we get closer towards Phoenix. What I'm going to do is use this as to help me with the air traffic control electric altitudes, and I'll make sure that we are 1,000 feet above the floor of Class B, so no lower than 7,000 feet. No lower than 9,000, 8,000 and 7,000 feet all the way down. We'll try and fly a downwind leg just around about Squaw Peak here before turning onto base around about the PXR 15 point. PXR is to the east of the airfield, so 15 miles, that'll be about a 12 mile final. And as I said, don't view this sort of thing as cheating, because in the real flying environment you'll have air traffic controllers looking after you all the way through these sort of approaches. (140 miles), so descending in about 35. For the reserve tanks. If you get the fuel level down to 2.3 tons, 2,300 kilograms, you can open the reserve tanks, or you can do it at top of descent as well. We'll do it at top of descent. And because I want to minimise my workload, we'll try and do it just a little bit earlier, because everything's going to happen at the same time. We're going to start the descent in 30 miles. That's going to take us out to about 64 outbound from Zuni. And we're looking for 91. The routing used for the flight is in the video description for all of the videos if you want to recreate it. People have asked about the flight plan format that I've posted in the video comments, the video descriptions. It's just something that was generated using SimBrief and then pasting the resulting information into a notepad document. Nothing more complicated than that. Because we're not using this INS unit to navigate, we could do the same thing down here. If I do waypoint change, 0, 6, insert, that gives me the distance to Phoenix on here as well, so it's more visible heads up. I've still got the ground speed displayed from the INS here, even when I'm using the radio to navigate. So descending in about 20 miles, I'm going to use that as a cue to open the reserve tanks. 1, 2, and that should start filling up the number 1 main, the number 4 main from the reserve tanks. The result should be about 5.2 tons in all of the tanks. We've got 20 tons on board, which is a nice place to be. The other information from the chart we've got is the minimum flight level, minimum altitude. We've got flight level 180 on this leg, dropping down to 12,000 as we get down towards Bunter. And after Bunter, we've got the minimum safe of 6.2 and 4.8. And remembering, I'm aiming to be about 8,000 feet, which is 7,000 feet above the field as we pass north of Phoenix. That should work out for the descent we've got planned. As we approach the descent, the other change I'm going to make is go from Mach mode to speed mode on the auto throttle. I'm going to descend with vertical speed, so I'll just adjust my bug to make sure it's on the selected airspeed or the selected airspeed I want to fly, and I'll just flick from Mach over to speed. You can fly the initial descent in Mach. You can do an idle descent by selecting IS or Mach there and just bring the power levers back. But I prefer to control it with the vertical speed mode. It makes for a more controlled and easier to understand descent initially. 114 miles to Phoenix, that's 10 miles until we start the descent, and the turning point is at 91 miles and we're at 58. So you notice that the altitude selector here, it's an alt cell rather than alt hold. That means the aircraft will continue to follow to try and correct any deviations in the altimeter to maintain the selected flight level 380. There's another secondary benefit to that alt cell mode, and that is if I dial the altitude selector slowly, the aircraft will try and follow. So look, here's 109 miles at the moment. All I'm going to do is wind this down to flight level 180 slowly, and you can see that the aircraft all by itself starts the descent to try and capture. Once it gets to 1500, that's the rate of descent it targets. I can then spin that down to flight level 180. So without me doing anything, it's basically stayed in alt cell mode, flying a 1500 feet per minute descent. 1500 or thereabouts. If I want to control the vertical speed directly, flick it to VS mode and then adjust using the wheel here. 20 miles until we turn. I'm going to use the flight engineer panel here and I'm going to start the cabin descending. The landing elevation is on this side. Make sure the baro set is correct. I'm just going to set it down to 1,100 feet for Phoenix, which is where we want to be, and you'll see the cabins descending as well. As we're descending, the fuel heat switches can go off. And check that the fuel is all transferring like it should do. We're back to navigation now, and we're going to turn in about 20 miles. So I've told you about the distance to descend. It's 3 times the height required. So at 30,000 feet below, you need 90 miles to do it. The rate of descent, look at your ground speed here. Take the last digit off, so that's 46. You need to be descending at half of that, 23, 2,300 feet per minute. Now obviously that's quite nose down at this altitude, so I'm sticking with 1,500 because I've got a little bit more space to play with. As we get lower, I'll be able to increase the rate of descent to be closer to 2,000 feet per minute. But you see it's still got a little bit of power on, it's still got a reasonable amount of power on. It's not quite idle, but it's not too far off. So 80 miles, that's a little bit to the turn. Same as before, I'll centralise the heading bug, I'll go into heading mode, I'll switch both of the units over to look at Winslow, so both of the HSIs are now looking at course pointer 1, and because that's off scale, I can put it into Vorlock and you'll see it goes into the capture mode now. So as soon as Winslow comes alive, it'll turn on track. And remember, it's only a short segment on this radial, so we need to get the next item queued up as well. There's the turn. So it's turning about 85 miles, that's roughly that 5 mile anticipation there. You can see it's going to turn nicely on track. I'm finished with Zuni now. The next frequency I need is PXR on 15.6. So we're using number 1, so it's the number 2 I want to change. I'm going to set 15.6 on here, and if I ident it, PXR. Excellent. And now rather than having to look at the INS, I've got the same information displayed on the DME pointer here. The next turn we want to make is onto track 214 towards the PXR, so I'll set that on here, on the side we're not using, 214, and that is at distance 57 outbound from Winslow. So about 20 miles to go. You can see from the RMI already it's going to be a very shallow intercept onto the PXR, so I probably have to do that one in heading mode and basically lead it on. So I want to be at the PXR at 8,000 feet. I'm at 32,000 feet at the moment. That means roughly when we get to 28,000 feet, we've got 20,000 feet to lose. That would be about 60 miles. So we're actually very close to where we need to be at the moment. Because we're descending lower and I've kept it in speed mode rather than Mach mode, you can see I've got a bigger margin now, the barber's pole here as well. So I've got a little bit more descent rate available to me. We're still okay though. So, turning at 57.5, again, I'll align the heading bug. And you just get into a routine. If this way of working doesn't work for you, then establish a way of working that does work for you and go from there. You can see on this leg we're able to be cleared down to 12,000 feet, so I'll set that on the altitude selector as well, 12,000. My altimeter is 1013 today. Fuel, it's all transferred, fuel tanks are all balanced, the fuel heat's off. I think the humidifier probably gets switched off as well, but I don't have the specifics on that. Not something to worry about overly. $10 miles to the turn, so we'll pop it onto heading mode. I'll change over to the PXR. Now we see that we've got the HSI showing for PXR. and I know when I get to about 57 it should line up with this. Now don't get tied up in knots with these radials not quite lining up. This is old school navigation and it is not as precise as GPS FMS navigation. As I said, there is a little bit of art to it as well as some science, and you just have to accept sometimes that the world is very analogue. The world doesn't have to be precise when we're doing this sort of thing. So notice there's 28,000 feet coming up with 66 miles to go to the PXR. I need about 2,000 feet per minute rate of descent now, so I'll just nudge the vertical speed down to 2,000. HSI is mostly centralised, so we'll turn onto the course, and then I'll give the control back to the Vorlock tracking and it engages in nav with alt cell still armed. We're going down to Bunter now. You see Bunter is 35 miles from the PXR, and then it's that radar heading 225. So PXR is the last radio aid I need for the arrival. We can tune the ILS on the side we're not using now. We'll say 111.75, and we'll set the front course on here at 078. So we will eventually transition to using that on both sides with it in dual mode so that the first officer has a separate source of information from the captain. It's not a good idea at low level on an instrument approach to only have a single source of information. But at the moment it's okay. So what have we got to lose as far as altitude goes now? At 24,000 feet, that's what, 16,000 feet to lose. 16 times 3, that's 16, 32, 48. And we're at 53. Our vertical speed is greater than half of the ground speed, so we should be improving on the profile. As we count down, just a reminder, it's 235, we're going to turn on to course 225. Because it's in Vorlock, I can set 225 in here as a reminder, and we'll just flick over at 35 miles. Cabin is descending appropriately. Everything else is looking good on the aircraft. Nothing to worry about at the moment. You see, if you want to fly faster, you can stay higher and descend steeper. But, you know, we're more or less at idle thrust now. A steeper descent in the early stages, it wouldn't really have added much to the equation, so we're just keeping it nice and relaxed. As I said, keep referring to these charts, and if you want to have the aircraft pointer on, that's fine. If you're new to VOR navigation, just view this as the experienced captain sitting next to you and telling you that you're doing the right thing. It's a crew experience. And again, don't be overly worried about the altitudes being slightly off if it doesn't quite match up. All that you really need to do is build an appreciation for whether you're high or low or on profile, and most importantly, know how to fix it as well. You see, as we get lower, the ground speed drops off because the true airspeed is reducing. Well, that means that I can back off the vertical speed as well. So if I was to be a little bit high on profile initially, you can take a little bit of comfort in the fact that you will be able to recover it as you get a bit lower as well. At 20,000 feet, that's what, 12,000 feet to lose. 12, 24, 36. So we should be at 20,000 feet, roughly at the 35 bell point here. You see I'm a little bit below profile now because of that higher vertical speed. I'll just nudge that back to about 1,700 feet or so. You see the DME from the ILS is dancing around a little bit. I think this is filtering. It uses libradial, which is the great add-on that's giving you proper radio aid simulation, but it is dancing around a little bit, which is a bit unexpected. So 35 miles, close enough, we go into heading mode. And below flight level 200 as well, with that I'll put the fasten seatbelt signs on, and I'll put some of the landing lights on for aircraft below flight level 180 in the US. So I'll leave the PXR tuned on the number 2 radio here, but I'm now no longer using it for navigation. So what I can do is set the inbound course so it's ready for the ILS. Spin it around to 078. And then if I go into dual mode, that means this HSI will show me the ILS, but I can still see the PXR on the pointer here. Clicking on here, track 225 is what we're looking for. The next chart I'll need on this part of Avatab is the approach chart, and then we'll go over to the map. You can see that we are exactly where we want it to be. Inside this area here, we'll go down to 9,000 feet, so I'll spin it down to 9,000. And I'll move this down here so that we can keep it on screen to be our friendly air traffic controller at the same time. So 16,000 feet, that's going to be 8,000 feet to lose, 8, 16, 24, we've got 26. So I'd say we're nicely on profile, and the vertical speed is appropriate for the ground speed. Into this area, we can go down to 8,000 feet safely. Again, I'm just using this as a surrogate for air traffic control, giving me proper terrain safe descent clearances. But it's an easy enough way to do it. I hope this is all making sense, and I hope you can feel the pace of the operation. Although it's a big jet and we're still doing, 400 miles an hour, everything is nice and slow, everything's thought ahead of. We've got everything tuned and set that we need. We've only got one frequency change to make, and we've got hopefully a right turn, a left turn, and a landing. 15,000 feet, I'll use that as a last opportunity to ask the flight engineer to sharp pencil the figures. I'll push the button on there, and if we look on the performance page, performance calc for the landing perf, if I read it from the sim for completeness, you can see that the clean speed is 20 knots above the flap 1 speed. It's not got a bug for the clean speed, so keep in mind your clean speed is flap 1 plus 20, 234. These are your individual flap minimum speeds there. So we can go down to 7,000 feet now, and I'll start bringing the speed back for 250 knots. So 5,000 feet to lose at 13, that would be 15 miles, and we've got approximately 15. So you can see that 3 times table approach, the multiplying by 3, and using a kind of broad brush figure. I mean, I know that we're using to a distance position that's over here, as opposed to not one that's over here, but it's close enough for this sort of thing. See, my ground speed is down to about 300 knots, so I'm just going to adjust the VS to minus 1500 and leave it there. That'll help the aircraft slow down as well. Beautiful Phoenix. You see the auto thrust is a little bit unstable in some places. It's not quite as smooth as you'd expect it to be. You can also see we're only actually 10 miles away from the airport. Remember, Phoenix is 1,000 feet above sea level, so that's effectively 10,000 feet above. It's not a bad place to be. So we can descend down to 6,000 feet now. And to keep everything simple, we've got the ignition. Now you can normally put the ignition on when you select flaps, but because it's a zero consequence action now, I'll switch them on. This is a new hotspot that's been added, so you got all of the ignition systems in one switch. Turning right onto downwind, that'll be 258. And I'm also going to slow down. Let's see, 234 is the minimum clean. So at 9,700 I've got 8,000 feet to lose, that'd be 24 miles. I know I've got at least 10 miles, 2 or 3 miles, and at least 10 miles there, so we should be there or thereabouts. Keep an eye out for the aircraft going into alt capture when you're doing this sort of thing. It can catch you out if you're not careful. There's 234. I'm going to set flaps 1 and bring the speed back to 214. So it's just that 20 knot increment, just set it for this bug here. So that's the flaps 1, 5, 10, 20, 25 and 30. My VREF speed is 134, but I'll fly it at 139 on the approach. And remember, you're doing pilot's job, engineer's job, air traffic controller's job at this point. So don't make it too complex on yourself. Don't do too many things. Don't try and be too slick with it if this is the way you're flying. I've got a stable indication from the DME now, so I'm going to change over the right hand side from Phoenix to the ILS 111.75. It does mean that I lose the bearing pointer, but that's okay. I can live with that. We can go down to 5,000 feet as we go into the next area here. So I've got flaps 1 on downwind, and we'll have flaps 5 as we turn onto base. I'm going to aim to turn roughly onto this 15-mile line here. Obviously if air traffic asks to slow down, you just slow down. That's what the flaps are for. So 5,600 feet to lose, about 5,000, that would be 15 miles. I've got 10 miles already with about 5 miles cross track. So I'm going to reduce my vertical speed down to just about 1,000 or so. And this is the point where you've got about 1,000 feet to go that it can capture, and it'll get a bit confusing. So if in doubt, just reset it to vertical speed mode and then make sure you've got alt cell. Let's take that next stage of flaps. So flaps 5.
Flaps 5.
Speed 194. And let's start with turn south. That's about 170. So at this rate of descent, I'm not going to go below 4,000 feet, so I'll be cleared down to 4,000 feet now. 4,000 is appropriate for this part in the proceedings. Always double check you've got that alt cell when you've made a change. So I'm 4,000 feet above the airfield at 12 miles out. That's a good place to be. 13.6, I would need 12 miles. So on an appropriate base leg, we'll change over the charts again to the airport chart. You see between Ilka and Jamal, we'd intercept at 4,000 feet. But on the turn, if we sequence through Jamal, 3,000 feet is appropriate. I'll take the next stage of flaps. Come back to 174. 174 is the clean manoeuvring speed there. So you see we've got alt capture. I'm going to select it down to 3,000 feet. Go back to vertical speed, and this is what air traffic control would do for you. Let's start the turn. And we'll put it into ILS mode. So there's nav and glide slope. It's captured the nav, so I'll set the runway track in the event of a missed approach.
Localizer alive.
And it'll reduce the vertical speed to help us capture the glide slope on our continuous descent. On the approach, I'll put the final landing lights and turn off lights on. And that's as established. Just the glide slope to pick up, so we can get rid of the chart and concentrate on flying the aircraft now. If you're new to the 747, you want to slow down a little bit early to make sure everything's nicely stabilised. It doesn't transition from auto thrust to manual thrust in a clean way like some other sim aircraft do, so it's better to slow down early. I'll take the next stage of flaps, flaps 20. I'll just select 160 initially. Flaps 20 is the last stage you can select without the landing gear down, but you can come all the way back to 160 knots, which for a big airplane is very impressive. So we're going to get a altitude capture, and then we'll get glide slope capture. You see what I said, always make sure that you get alt cell. It would have continued to descend there. There we go, back into glide slope. And I can set 5,000 for the missed approach. I'll put the gear down.
Gear down.
We'll arm the speed brake. I'll slow down initially to the flap 20 speed.
Gears down, green light.
So gear down with green. Next stage of flap.
Flaps 25.
And finally flap 30.
Flaps 30.
And back to that 139 approach speed. So we've got gear down, 3 greens, lights on, runway ahead, on speed, landing clearance received. Five miles to go. What I'm going to do is take the auto thrust out first. I'm going to use my mouse pointer, just as a reminder here that I need the lever about there, and then I'll just line it back up. And then have a look at what you've got here. It should be about 1.1. Keep the speed in the scan. Now notice I've got the auto thrust out and the autopilot is still engaged. That's just to let me sort out any instability that we get because of how you disconnect the auto thrust in X-plane. 1,000 feet, I'll take the autopilot out. The stock binding doesn't work, so just touch the trim and you'll get the autopilot out. And keep following the flight directors. Now when you hear the radial come alive with the tone, you want to prevent the nose from dropping. That's the issue I was telling you about. Make sure you're looking at the far end of the runway and don't allow the nose to drop. Check that you're on speed and make sure that you're in trim. When you get to 500, there's a slight tendency to go high, so check your speed. Fly it on the flight directors if you have to, but make sure you're cross-referencing outside. On the centre line, on speed, on slope. Listen for the tone. Stop the nose from dropping, it's very obvious.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Check reverse.
Reverse. And we're vacating at the end, so I don't need auto brake today. I'll just give it a squeeze on the brakes to make sure the brakes are going to work.
60 knots.
Excellent. 60 knots. Remember, we've got body gear steering that we need to arm, otherwise we'll not be able to vacate the runway. And I'll take the reverses into forward idle. Now that's all we want to do at this point, just cancel the reverse. We've got all the lights on, we've got the flaps out and the spoilers out. That's not the end of the world. All we want to do is to get the aircraft off the runway, because remember, we've got the job of 3 people to do in the simulator, and if you're flying online, then the controllers just have to be a little bit patient as you're sorting it out. Also remember, we're sitting quite high up here, so we're still doing about 35 knots. I'll squeeze the brakes to slow down comfortably, down to 10 knots or so. And then I'm going to vacate right using the tiller here. So just to check, the body gear steering's armed and it's energized. There we go. So just concentrate on steering and don't worry about the flaps, the gear, the lights or any of the other busy work. Right, that should be the aircraft off the runway now, so I'll squeeze it on the toe brakes. I'll set the parking brake momentarily and we'll clean the aircraft up. So let's have the lights off. The strobe lights can go off. And we'll bring the flaps up. And the spoilers. And disarm. On the flight engineer panel, we're going to start the APU. That's here. We're going to switch off the galley power. And the galley chillers. Because we're done with those now. And I'm also going to open the split system breaker so that the 2 sides of the aircraft are fed separately, just to make it a smoother transition onto APU power. Hydraulics are fine just now. On the overhead panel we can have the pitot heat, the prop heaters can go off. We can have the ignition off. Everything else we'll leave till we get on the stand. Let's park the aircraft.
Parking brake released.
We can have the flight directors off as well. The stand 27 is over here. We're just going to park on the corner.
Flaps up.
I missed one click on my flap selector. And because we don't have any guidance or any marshals on here, I'll make sure the aircraft is roughly pointing at where I want it to go. We'll have all the lights off. And then go into external view, and we'll just use the external view to basically self-marshal ourselves onto stand. You can shut down the outboard engines if you really want, but it's more hassle than it's worth on a short taxi like this. Inside,
Parking brake set.
parking brake is set. Excellent. Take a second, make sure it's not rolling away. Onto the engineer panel, you can see that the APU is running, but it's not on bus. So let's put it on bus. We're going to close the generators, and then the reason for the split system breaker, I do that one, we get 2. I do this one, we get the other 2, so it's not a single surge on there. So the APU is on bus. Then we can shut the engines down. 3, 2, 1. Over here, hydraulic pumps. We've got parking brake pressure. So we'll have the ADPs off. We'll have the fuel pumps off. Remember that the number 2 main, that pump is still running because of the APU running. The reserve valves, so the reserve tanks are empty, so we'll close the valves and have it set in the same state as we choose for fueling. Over here, because we're parked, we'll have that beacon light off. Transponder can go to standby. yeah, I should have switched the radar off before parking as well. That's why we have checklists. And that's us done. That's the 747-200 London to Phoenix. I hope the approach into Phoenix was worth waiting for. As I said, I do apologise you've had to wait longer than I ever intended for this video. I just wasn't happy with the landing characteristics of the 747 after the first update, and it's only in the very latest update, which is only a few weeks ago, that it's actually got back to the point that I'm reasonably happy with it. It's still not quite right in the final stages, so the little life hack of setting that radial to 60-65 feet, and when you hear the tone from the radial, focus on the far end of the runway and stop the aircraft from lowering the nose, and you should get on okay. I hope you've enjoyed the 747-200 series. I had hoped to do a little bit more with it, but I've also got some Challenger videos I need to do. We'll maybe look at the 747 in some streams a little bit later on in the year. Again, thanks very much for sticking with the channel. Thanks for waiting so long for the 747 video. And I do love reading your comments, even if it does take me a little bit longer to respond to them. Thanks for your patience, and we'll speak to you next time.